Alberta's United Conservative Party leadership race is becoming somewhat of a crowded field these days. We're going to be interviewing as many of the candidates as we can to give you an idea of where they're coming from. Today, we are joined by Danielle Smith. She is the former leader of the Wild Rose Party and now a candidate in the UCP leadership. We're so happy to have her on. Welcome to Bridge City News today, Danielle. Great to have you here.
My pleasure.
Absolutely. So Danielle, you're getting some praise at the same time, heaps of criticism over your promise to implement the Alberta Sovereignty Act. If you end up becoming premier, can you explain what this Sovereignty Act would actually do?
It's a pretty simple piece of legislation. It would just basically be reasserting our Charter of Rights and Freedoms and reasserting that the Constitution matters and that our provincial jurisdiction under Section 92 has to be respected. Unfortunately, we've got a federal government that is lawless. They have acted like the Charter doesn't exist, and they acted like the Constitution doesn't exist. And it's created a lot of uncertainty. We've had multiple projects that have been canceled because they can't see the way through to the finish line because they don't know how to get through the regulatory process, which has been made even more cumbersome by the federal government. This would just be asserting that we've got the right to develop our natural resources. It's been established in the Constitution. And we also have the right to protect our citizens from government overreach. And so it would be on a case-by-case basis that we would invoke it. But by declaring that we would pass the Alberta Sovereignty Act, we're just drawing a line in the sand. We're telling Ottawa to stay in its lane. And if they don't, we're going to push them out.
Okay, so Danielle, but critics are arguing that this is unconstitutional and that you can't really enforce it, considering that the federal government has its own tools to fight back, including withholding transfer funds from Alberta.
I guess what I would like is for Ottawa to treat us with the same respect as Quebec. And I'll give a few examples of the way in which provinces have asserted their constitutional rights. So, for instance, when the Emergencies Act was passed, and we now are beginning to see with the hearings that there was no justification for it, Quebec held an emergency session of their assembly and said, we're not going to enforce that here. We should have done the same. When they started seizing bank accounts, we should have encouraged people to move their money over to credit unions and said, sorry, that's against our constitutional rights. We are not enforcing that. I suspect that in the fall, we're going to see new mandates come in from the federal level. And I've heard loud and clear, especially from moms who are concerned about their kids. They do not want their kids forced back into any kind of restrictions. And if they put pressure on us, we'll just say, no, we're not going to enforce that. British Columbia has just recently said they're not going to enforce the laws on hard drugs. They, for years, didn't enforce the legislation around our criminal code legislation around possession and use of drugs. And now they've extended it to heroin and crystal meth and fentanyl with the government's blessing. So it seems to me we've got lots of precedent for different provinces to say, you know what, we have a different culture here. We want to enforce our laws in a different way here. And we're just asking for Alberta to be treated the same. And we're going to assert that we will be.
Okay, well, the UCP obviously seems to be deeply divided. So how do you propose to bring the party together?
There's I think a couple of issues that have caused us to lose support. One of them was the fact that we took a 180-degree turn from what we said we were going to do on vaccine mandates and vaccine passports. We'd gone so far as to change the public health legislation, saying we would never force anyone to get vaccinated. And then they ended up changing their mind in September. I think that caused a permanent lack of trust. And that would be one thing I would say is there's another way when we get into respiratory virus season to better protect our seniors. We won't be locking down again. We won't be firing people from their jobs because they've made a certain medical choice. In fact, I'd go so far as to amend the Human Rights Act to make sure that people cannot be discriminated against on the basis of medical choice or their political opinions. I think that will win back one portion. The other part of the problem has been all of these autonomy groups that have started up, whether it's the Buffalo Project or whether it's the Alberta Prosperity Project or the Wild Rose Independence Party, they're frustrated that we haven't acted on the mandate that we were given to end equalization. And from what I have seen over the past 20 years, we keep on arguing that we need to assert ourselves more like Quebec, collect our own income tax, collect our own pension, collect our own employment insurance, have our own police service. And we've got to start acting on those things, and we'll win that part of the party back as well. So this is why I've taken such a strong position that people want to see us act. They don't want to see us write stern letters. They don't want to see us continue to fight things through the courts that have been stacked by Ottawa appointees and seem to always go against us. They want to see us respect the Constitution, assert our rights, and demand to have the same respect. as Quebec does in our federation. That's what we need to do to be able to win those votes back.
Okay, Danielle, many people believe that Jason Kenney lost the confidence of the party over the way that he handled the COVID pandemic. So you're saying that under your leadership, there would be no provincial lockdowns, and you're saying no to mandatory vaccinations. But Kenney made similar promises and then gave in to the pressure, I guess, to change. So why should voters believe that with you it will be different?
I've been watching this unfold over the last 2 years, and I've been looking at the politicians who did have the courage to stand up in the face of pressure, like Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and Governor of South Dakota Kristi Noem. You can look at, I don't understand why there's been such suppression of the full range of discussion around what our medical options are, but we now know after 2 years that we do have options. Focus protection should always have been the approach. I think what we will see once we start looking at the jurisdictions around the world that did the best, and Alberta did pretty well, it was because we did a better job than other jurisdictions of making sure our folks in long-term care were protected. And so that's the approach that we take, not preventing kids from going to school or preventing people from going to restaurants or forcing them and coercing them to take vaccines. We've got to protect those who are most vulnerable. So make sure that we do that in our nursing homes, make sure that we've got effective therapeutics so that when somebody does get diagnosed with COVID, they can have a treatment to prevent them from deteriorating and going into hospital. That should have been the approach over the last year and a half, and that will be the approach when we get into the fall respiratory virus season.
Okay, so you obviously have very different ideas on how to handle the future pandemic issues should they arise, and how to deal with healthcare issues. Will MLAs be able to voice their opinions freely, or will they have to toe the line?
I believe in the individual autonomy of MLAs. I think part of what happens with caucus solidarity is when you have members pass policy on certain issues, you kind of expect that if you're going to run for the party, that you're going to endorse what the members say. There was no policy on emerging issues, especially around COVID. And instead, we didn't actually listen to our MLAs. If we had, we probably would have taken slightly different approaches in Calgary and Edmonton versus our rural areas. We saw in other jurisdictions like BC and Ontario that they did have a more nuanced approach with fewer restrictions in outlying areas. And if we had done that, I think we would have been able to have a better balance. So I would say that the only way you get that feedback is if MLAs are able to go out into their community, do town halls, bring that feedback back to caucus, and make sure that those senior leadership is listening to it. When I was a leader the last time, we always relied on our MLAs to tell us what was going on in the community. And it wasn't just a wild rose concept. That's how Ralph Klein and Peter Lougheed operated as well. They made sure that if they were going to pass something, that they had buy-in on the caucus. Because if you can't convince your caucus, you're not going to be able to convince the general public either. So I think that's been a missing piece, but we would certainly bring that back.
Okay, Albertans are frustrated with the federal government's position on oil and gas. So what would you do to create a better playing field for the energy sector?
I'm going to look at this from a constitutional perspective. If you look at our constitution, we have the exclusive right to develop our resources. And Ottawa has been interfering in our jurisdiction every step of the way. We recently got a judgment from the Court of Appeal saying that their Bill C-69, which is, we've been calling it the No More Pipelines Act, but it's kind of the No More Build Anything Anywhere Act. They've said that that goes way too far. So we would push them back on that, continue with the court litigation. But more importantly, we've got to start acting independently. And I want people to be in the mindset of the fact that we do have the sovereign right to make these decisions over our resources. And what would we do if we didn't have Ottawa standing in our way? I would say that what we would do is we would start developing economic corridors with our partners. The one that is the furthest along in development is from Fort McMurray to Churchill. Partner with our First Nations, partner with Saskatchewan and Manitoba. We own most of that land anyway because it was transferred to us as Crown land. Develop a 10-kilometer wide right of way. Build rail infrastructure, build water and electricity infrastructure, bring heating and broadband to those communities, and then also build oil and gas pipelines. And that would be the way that we would get to one port. We can also do something similar, working with our First Nations to get to Thunder Bay, to Tuktoyaktuk in the north, to Port of Prince Rupert. And that to me is the way that Alberta can assert itself as the leader on economic development in Western Canada. And I'm not going to wait until Ottawa approves that. I'm going to work with our partners and make sure that we start working on those corridors. We've been talking about it since the 1930s. It's time to start acting on it.
Okay, what about clean green energy? Where do you see Alberta taking this sector?
We are so far advanced on carbon technology that allows us to capture CO2, bury it underground, and turn it into useful products like carbon nanofiber, which is a new construction material that could replace steel. We can use CO2 to make a more durable cement for industrial minerals, for plastics, even alcohol. We also have the ability with our hydrogen economy that we're building out in central or in the Edmonton area. That's going to be a major transformation of how we use our natural gas resources, capture the CO2, and then power all of our transportation vehicles with hydrogen. I've talked to companies that want to develop bitumen for asphalt. Once again, whether you're going to drive a regular car or a zero emissions car, you need roads to drive them on. There's also a movement in the oil sands. We've heard with the Pathways Net Zero project, they want to use small modular reactors to develop their resource so that it reduces the greenhouse gas footprint. And I also have a strategy for how we're going to recover all of our abandoned and suspended well sites. So I will put our environmental record up against any other oil producing jurisdiction in the world. And we are seeing a major transformation on how we use our resources that not only allow us to meet targets of energy security, but also energy affordability and be miles ahead of anyone else when it comes to environmental considerations. So I think we can sell that to the world.
Okay, Danielle, what about healthcare? Should we keep throwing money at it, or well, wait times and physicians availability, they don't seem to be improving. So are you open to making some kind of private healthcare part of the equation, or what's your take on that?
The main thing we need to do, and I think people want to make changes to healthcare that fall under the umbrella of the Canada Health Act, and I'm perfectly happy to do that. The issue that we have in healthcare is we've got way too many administrators and bureaucrats who are preventing dollars from flowing down to the front line. So I want to return to having individual hospital boards with funding following the patient to those facilities to create a motivation for our hospitals to figure out ways that they can deliver more services and get rewarded for it. I also want to see health spending accounts. It's a kind of concept that many businesses use where they give their workers a little bit of money so that they can pay for all the things that aren't covered by healthcare. A lot of people that I've spoken with who want vaccine choice, they also use alternative medicine to keep themselves well. They use massage therapists and physiotherapy and chiropractic. They want to go to counselors and therapists and dietitians. None of that is covered right now. So let's help people with a little bit of money so that they can take care of their conditions at the front end so that we don't end up with so many people in hospital because of chronic conditions that have been allowed to get acute. We need a major transformation in who makes the decisions and who gets the money, and we've got to start squeezing out those management layers. So I'm prepared to do that transformation. We've got to get started on that too.
And then, of course, along that same vein, there's been a very tense relationship between the provincial government and doctors. So what would you do to change this situation?
We've got to realize our fight is not with the frontline operators. It's not the doctors that we should be fighting with, not the paramedics, not the nurses. They're just as frustrated, I think, with the level of bureaucratic interference and them being able to do their job. They're just as frustrated with the mismanagement. They're just as frustrated in not having the resources on the front line. So I think that we can have very positive relationship with our front line, get more dollars to them so that we can hire more doctors, we can attract more nurses back into the profession. We can make sure that our paramedics aren't sitting for an entire shift at hospital waiting rooms because they can't offload patients. These are all management issues. And so if we work together on solving those management issues, I am confident that we will repair a relationship with the front line and get better service for patients.
Okay, and then as far as law enforcement goes, do you believe, Danielle, that it's a good idea for Alberta to have its own police force? Is it worth the extra financial cost?
Yes, and I would start it immediately for a couple reasons. We've had a lot of our frontline officers who've been fired from their jobs or put on leave because they refused to enforce some of the draconian decisions that have come down. I talked to an RCMP officer who was supposed to be on the crew that went and arrested Pastor Coates, and he refused to do that. That's the kind of person that I want in law enforcement, somebody who will value religious rights, someone who will value our charter rights. He also chose not to be vaccinated, and that is his right as a person who has bodily autonomy. So those are the kind of people that I want to see have jobs in law enforcement so that we can change the culture of law enforcement. One of the things that I hear frustration with in rural Alberta is the length of time it takes for our current officers to get out to calls when there's property damage or vandalism or theft. That would be a way in which our Alberta Provincial Police could augment the law enforcement. And then I also hear frustration in our big cities. We've got so many of our calls that are being responded to are mental health calls, are addiction calls, and we need a force that can better connect people who are in that kind of distress with the health system and the services that they need to be able to get clean from drugs so that they can get back into having a normal independent life. And I think that if we train our Alberta provincial police officers in a high level of soft skills and negotiation and the ability to respond to those mental health calls, they'll be able to act as an additional service to where we're having problems in our big city centers. So I don't think there's any reason to delay. And I think that they'll do such a good job that we'll be able to expand that service out. But we've got to also get started by beginning that force so that we can take control over our own policing. And we know that we've got a police agency that responds to the priorities of Alberta.
So many more questions I'd like to get to, which we're running out of time, but I do want to fit one more in. Danielle, you have admitted that you made a mistake back when you were leading the Wild Rose Party and crossed the floor to the Progressive Conservatives. So what vibes are you getting from the current UCP members? Are they willing to forgive and forget and move on, or what are you getting?
Well, there's no question it was a mistake in 2015, and I ended up losing my nomination, and Jim Prentice ended up losing the election. I think people now can begin to see that part of what we were trying to do is to bring unity to the Conservative movement. I mean, we did it the wrong way, and the public wasn't ready for it at that time. But now I'm hearing is fear that the unity that we brought, that Jason Kenney and Brian Jean brought by bringing the party together, is going to bust apart. I don't want to see that happen. I know Brian Jean doesn't want to see that happen. It's why both of us have jumped into this race, is that we want to keep this movement together. Both of us gave up an awful lot for unity, and I believe that the UCP project is one that's worth saving. I think that we can be unified as a Conservative movement, and if we do bust apart, we're going to end up with another 4 years or 8 years of NDP government, and I don't want to see that. When the NDP came in, investment in the province stopped. We had a ton of job loss. We saw an escalation in spending, an escalation in debt, and we're just now back into surplus. I want to make sure that we can maintain some Conservative values in how we manage those resources on behalf of taxpayers, and also do a better job of delivering those frontline care programs. So that's the reason why I'm in the race, is to be a force of unity, and I'm glad to be getting some of the positive feedback that I am, because I think it's time to make a change so we can put Alberta first.
Thanks so much for being with us today, Danielle. Good luck in your campaign.
My pleasure.